This is a message from a viewer named Grady, and the moment I finished reading it, I understood I was looking at something I had never covered before on this channel. Not a con, not a sweetheart swindle, not a professional crew running a playbook, but something quieter and, in its own way, more frightening. A grown man, 62 years old, who did not lose his life savings to a fake woman on the internet. A man who fell in love with a real woman in a real city and moved his whole life halfway around the world to be with her. And then one ordinary evening he did the one thing, an American man from Tupelo, Mississippi is raised to believe he has every right to do. He defended his home and it detonated everything, not because he was wrong about what was happening in that apartment. In one important way he was completely right, but being right in a place you do not understand, in a language you cannot speak, in a family you never bothered to learn, that is a particular kind of danger. And it is the danger this man walked straight into with the confidence of a Mississippian who had never once been made small in his own country. Grady Hinsarling is a retired long-haul trucker, 40 years behind the wheel and later in the dispatch yard. Divorced decades ago, one grown son back home who works on diesel engines. He is blunt, generous within his own rules, territorial about his money and his space, and he grew up believing that a man's house is his castle, that you handle your own business, that you do not owe anyone anything you did not agree to owe. Those beliefs served him well in Mississippi for 6 decades. They served him catastrophically in a working-class port city in northern Vietnam, in an apartment full of a woman's family, in a culture where the word family means something so different from what he understood that he might as well have been speaking a foreign language even when he thought he was making himself perfectly clear. What follows is his story, in his own words, of how a real love and a comfortable retirement and a fresh start in a beautiful country became, one screaming evening, the most dangerous position of his life, and of what happened next. Because the part that made him write to me is not the night he threw them out. It is what came after. While you're watching, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if this kind of honest, painful story is what you come here for, that little super thanks button below is entirely optional, but it genuinely helps me keep making them. My name is Grady Wilbur Hinsarling. I am 62 years old, and I need to tell you about the worst decision of my retirement, which is a strange thing to say because on paper it started as one of the best. But you have to hear the beginning to understand the end, and you have to hear all of it, because the version of this story I told myself for a long time was not the true one. And I only figured out the true one after I had already lost the things I most wanted to keep. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. I grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, which is Elvis's town if you don't know it. But for most of us who actually live there, it was just a hot little place in the northeast corner of the state, with more churches than gas stations, and a whole lot of pickup trucks. My daddy drove a truck. My uncle drove a truck. When I turned 19, I got my Class A license and drove a truck too, because that is what men in my family did. And I did it for 40 years without complaint, and mostly without incident. I saw every state in the lower 48 from the inside of a cab. I ate at every truck stop that ever fried a country ham. I got married when I was 24. To a girl named Rebecca, who was pretty and patient for about the first 6 years. And then somewhere around the 10th year, she stopped being patient. And by the 15th year, she stopped being anything at all where I was concerned. And by the 17th year, we signed the papers and she moved to Memphis with my son Cody, and I kept driving. Cody grew up on weekend visits and long phone calls from truck stops in Nebraska and Ohio. And to his credit, he did not turn out to hate me for it. He grew up into a diesel mechanic in Tupelo, married a nurse, gave me a grandbaby, and calls me every Sunday whether I answer or not. He is a better man than I am. That is not a false modesty thing. That is just something I know. I stopped driving over the road when I was 58 because my back went out for the 3rd time in 2 years, and my dispatcher told me I would be more useful in the office than in the ditch, and he was probably right. I did 4 years as a freight dispatcher in a yard outside Tupelo, sitting on a swivel chair yelling into a headset at drivers who reminded me of a younger version of myself And then I turned 62 and I looked around at my little rental house with the tin roof and the two-burner stove and the same fried okra place I had been eating at since the Reagan administration, and I thought, what in the name of God am I doing? I had my pension from the trucking company, about $1,600 a month. I had my Social Security, which added another $1,100 on top of that. I had a savings account with a little over $120,000 in it that I'd been putting into for 30 years and had never touched because I never had a reason to. I owned no house. I owned no wife. I owned a Ford pickup with 240,000 miles on it and a dog named Boone who was 13 years old and blind in one eye, and I did not feel finished. That is the honest thing. I did not feel like a man who is supposed to sit on a porch in Tupelo, Mississippi and wait for the next thing, because the next thing in Tupelo when you are 62 and single is not something you look forward to. I got on the internet one night after too many beers, and I started reading about places a man could go with a small pension and a savings account and live like a king. Costa Rica came up, Mexico came up, the Philippines came up a lot, and Vietnam came up. I did not know a single thing about Vietnam that I had not learned from movies my daddy would not let me watch as a kid, and I felt a certain old American discomfort about the country for reasons anyone my age can guess. But the men writing about it on those forums were not writing about the war. They were writing about coffee that cost 40 cents, about apartments in beautiful cities that rented for $300 a month, about people who were friendly and food that was clean and a pace of life that let a man breathe. And I read about it for 6 months before I made a single move, because I am not an impulsive man about most things, whatever you may conclude by the end of this story. I made a profile on a dating app that specialized in Western men meeting women in Southeast Asia. I did not put down anything untrue. I said I was a retired trucker from Mississippi, 62, divorced, one son, looking for a serious relationship with a woman who wanted a companion and a quiet life. I posted a picture of myself standing next to my truck the year before I retired, wearing a ball cap and squinting into the sun, and I did not expect much. I got a lot of messages I ignored because they read like someone had cut and pasted them out of a manual. I ignored the ones from women in their 20s for the obvious reason that I am not a fool, whatever else I am. And after about 3 weeks of scrolling, I got a message from a woman named Thu from a city in northern Vietnam called Hai Phong. And her message was 3 sentences long, and it said, "Hello, Mr. Grady. I saw your profile, and I like that you drove a truck, because my father was a driver too. I hope you are having a good day." That was it. No hearts, no emojis, no photo of her in a bikini on a beach. Just 3 sentences and a picture of a woman in her early 40s with her hair pulled back, standing in what looked like an office, wearing a plain gray blouse and no makeup that I could tell, and looking at the camera like she had a slight headache and was being polite about it. I wrote her back that evening. I told her my father had driven a truck too, and that I was retired now and thinking about where I might go next, and I asked her about her city. Her English was not perfect, but it was clear enough, and she wrote back the next morning her time. That is how it started. Not with fireworks, not with love bombing, which is a phrase I did not even know at the time, but which I have since learned to recognize when I see it. Just a slow, ordinary correspondence between 2 people in their 40s and 60s who had both had hard lives and both wanted something quieter for the second half. She was 41, divorced, one teenage son named Nyert, who was 14, working in the office of a garment factory in Hai Phong, from a family that had been in that city for 4 generations. Her father had been a driver on the docks, hauling containers around the port, until his back gave out about 10 years ago. Her mother was a housewife and, in Thu's words, the general of the family. Her younger brother worked for himself, running various small businesses that never quite worked, which is a description I did not think much about at the time and which I now see was a warning she was too polite to make plainer. We wrote for about 4 months before we ever spoke on video. When we did, she was shy about it, and I liked that. She sat in her kitchen with the light coming in behind her, and answered my questions and asked me a few of her own, and we talked about nothing much. The weather in Hai Phong, the weather in Tupelo, her son's schoolwork, my son's baby, the kind of food she cooked, the kind of food I ate, which she found funny in a way that made her cover her mouth. There was nothing hot about it. It was just easy, and that easiness was what got me. I had not had easy conversation with a woman since I was in my 20s. Rebecca and I stopped talking about anything real about 6 months into our marriage, and after the divorce I ran through a handful of women in Tupelo who were fine people but nothing ever caught. With Thu, something caught. I do not know how else to say it. I flew to Haiphong for the first time about 6 months after her first message. 3 weeks. I stayed in a small hotel near the river, and she came to see me every day after she got off work. And on the weekend, she showed me around her city. Haiphong is not a tourist city. It is a port city, working gritty, hot in the summer and gray in the winter, with a smell of diesel and river water and street food that I found I actually liked once I got used to it. It is not Ho Chi Minh City with its skyscrapers, and it is not Hanoi with its old French neighborhoods. It is where the ships come in, and where the containers get moved, and where regular working people live, and I felt at home in it in a way I did not expect. It reminded me, in some way I could not quite name, of a Mississippi port town, hard-working, unpretentious, and not trying to sell itself to anyone. On the second week of that trip, she took me to meet her family. I want to be careful here, because what I say next is going to sound one way, and I have to make sure you hear it right. Her family welcomed me like I was already one of them. Her mother, a small woman named Balan who could not have weighed 90 pounds and who spoke not one word of English, hugged me the way my own grandmother used to hug me, and made me sit down at a little plastic table in their front room and fed me until I could not move. Her father, Ong Quay, was 69 and thin and clearly not well, and he shook my hand with both of his hands and looked me in the eye for a long time and said something to Thu in Vietnamese. And Thu translated it as, he says, "You have kind eyes." He is happy his daughter has met someone who is kind. Her brother Sang was 38 and quick, with a smile and had a handshake like a car salesman, and I noticed even then that his eyes went to my watch and to my shoes. But I put it down to curiosity, because I was a foreigner in his mother's front room, and of course he was going to look. And then there was Thu's son Yurt, 14 years old, quiet, thin, with the same slight headache look his mother had in her photo, and he shook my hand like a small, serious man and did not smile once that whole first meeting, which I respected. I spent the third week of that trip mostly at the family's house. Balan cooked for me every night. Ong Quay sat with me on the little balcony and did not say anything I could understand, but seemed to enjoy my company anyway. Nyert warmed up to me by the end of the week, particularly after I showed him a picture of my truck, and he wanted to know how many gears it had and how fast it would go loaded down a hill. Sang came by twice, both times with a business idea he wanted to tell me about through Thu, and both times I nodded politely and said very interesting and changed the subject, and both times Thu looked embarrassed and later apologized for her brother. "Do not mind him," she said. "He always has ideas. He is the youngest, and my mother spoiled him. Do not feel you have to listen." And I did not, that trip. I flew home to Tupelo 3 weeks later, and I was in love in the way a 62-year-old man gets in love, which is not the way a 19-year-old does, but is arguably worse because you know what you are risking. I flew back 3 months later for another 3 weeks. Same hotel, same routine. This time we started talking seriously about what came next. She could not leave Vietnam. Her son was in school. Her parents were in Haiphong. Her mother, in particular, would not survive her leaving. I could see all of that. And I did not really want to bring her to Tupelo anyway. What would she do in Tupelo? Sit in a rental house with a tin roof and watch me watch football? No. If this was going to happen, it was going to happen in Haiphong. I told her on the last night of that second trip that I was going to sell what little I had, close out my life in Mississippi, and move over. She cried, and I want to be clear that I still believe those tears were real. She was not acting. Whatever else went sideways later, that moment on that little hotel balcony was two people who loved each other and were making a plan together. And if you take nothing else from this story, take that. It was not a scam from the beginning. It never became one. Not really. It became something else. And that something else is what I have to explain. I flew home, gave my notice at the dispatcher job, sold the pickup, gave Boone to my son Cody because there was no way I was putting a 13-year-old dog on an airplane to Southeast Asia, packed 2 large suitcases with what I actually cared about, and put everything else in a storage unit outside Tupelo that I told myself I would deal with later and that, as of this recording, I still have not dealt with. Cody drove me to the airport in Memphis. On the drive, he was quiet for a long stretch, and then he said, "Pop, you sure about this?" And I said, "No, I'm not sure, but I am sure I do not want to sit in Tupelo waiting to die." And he said, "That ain't the same as being sure." And I said, "No, it is not." And he did not say anything else about it that drive. But the last thing he said to me before I went through security was, "You don't even speak the language, Pop. You are moving in with a woman and a family you can't talk to. Just remember that when it gets hard." And I said I would, and I got on the plane. The first 3 months in Haiphong were as close to happy as I have been in my adult life. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building about a 15-minute walk from Thu's family's house. The rent was 7 million dong a month, which was about $280. And the place was clean and had a little balcony where I could sit in the morning with a cup of the Vietnamese coffee that I had by that point become genuinely addicted to. Thu kept her job at the garment factory. I took her son to school in the morning on the back of a little motorbike I had bought used for $800. And I picked him up in the afternoon, and in between I walked around the city and drank coffee and got fatter than I had been in 20 years because the food was that good. Thu and I ate dinner together every night, sometimes at the apartment, sometimes at her mother's house, and I was, for the first time since I was in my 20s, part of something that felt like a household. On the weekends, her family came over, her mother, her father when he was well enough, sang sometimes, with or without a business idea. Various aunts and uncles I could not keep straight, and a rotating cast of small cousins who called me Back Grady, which means Uncle Grady, and who wanted to touch my beard because none of the men in that family had one. I want to describe to you what I did not understand at the time, and what I have come to understand since, because it is the key to the whole thing. In Mississippi, a family is your wife or husband, your kids, and maybe your parents if they are still alive and living close by. Everyone else is relatives. You see them at Thanksgiving. You send them a Christmas card. If they need something serious, you help them. But they do not live in your house. They do not touch your money. They are not part of the daily unit. In Vietnam, particularly in a working-class family in a city like Haiphong, family is a completely different animal. Family is your parents, your siblings' children, your aunts and uncles, your cousins, and all of them are part of a shared economic and emotional and physical space that does not close its doors the way an American house closes its doors. Money moves through that space in a way an American finds bewildering. The eldest daughter, which Thu was, has particular obligations to her parents that do not end when she moves out or gets married. If a member of the family needs something, the entire family responds, and the ones with money give to the ones without. Not as a loan, not as charity, but as the way things are. Nobody counts. Nobody keeps a ledger. Nobody says thank you formally because thank you would imply this was a favor and not simply what you do. None of this was explained to me. Not because Thu was hiding it, because Thu did not know it needed to be explained. To her, it was like the air. You do not sit a fish down and explain water to it. I walked into that apartment on the 4th floor and I thought I was setting up a household of 2 adults and 1 teenage boy, plus grandparents visiting for dinner. What I was actually doing, without knowing it, was becoming a node in a much larger family economic network. And the fact that I was a Western man with a pension and $120,000 in the bank meant I was, whether I understood it or not, the most important node in that network. Not the father of it, not the head of it that was Ba Lan, but the wealthiest one, and therefore the one whose resources were now, in a way I did not perceive at the time, communal resources. The first sign was Ba Lan starting to spend the night at our apartment. It began about 6 weeks in, and it began innocently enough. Thu had been working late a couple of nights, and Yurt needed someone to cook dinner and be there when he got home from school. And Ba Lan came over to do it. That is a grandmother helping. Every culture has that. The first night she stayed over, I did not think anything of it because it was late and she was old, and going home in the dark on a moped seemed unnecessary. But then she was there the next night, and the night after that. And by the end of the second week, I realized she had brought a small bag with some of her things in it, and it was living in our second bedroom, which had until then been Nurt's room. And Nurt was now sleeping on a mat on the living room floor because his grandmother was in his bed. And I said to Thu, "When is your mother going back to her house?" And Thu looked at me, like I had asked her, when the sun was going back into the ground. And she said, "Why would she go back? My father is fine at home. She is here to help. She is happy here. Do you not want her here?" That was the first moment. I want you to hear it, because it is the moment where if I had been a different man, or a smarter one, or one who had done some reading before he flew over, I would have stopped and had a conversation. I would have said, "Thu, in my country, grown people do not live with their partner's mother unless it has been discussed and agreed to. In my country, a 2-bedroom apartment is meant for 2 people or a small family, not for 3 generations. In my country, when a bag of clothes shows up in the spare bedroom, that is a decision that gets made by both partners together." I would have said all of that, calmly, sitting at our little table with a cup of coffee, and I would have listened to her response, and we would have worked something out. That is what an emotionally healthy man would have done. I did not do that. What I did was mumble that of course I wanted her there. Of course she was welcome. And then I walked out onto the balcony and sat and stewed and did not say another word about it. That is the Mississippi in me. That is my father in me. You do not make a scene. You do not make a woman feel her mother is not welcome. You swallow it, and you swallow it, and you swallow it, and one day you find out you cannot swallow anything else, and then you make the worst scene of your life. But I did not know that yet. I just knew Ba-Line was in the spare bedroom, and I did not know how to say I did not want her there. The next sign was the money. Thu came to me about 2 months in, on a Sunday morning, and told me her father needed a medication that his health insurance did not cover well, and that he had been going without it for a while and it was affecting his heart. The medication cost about 2 million dong a month, which was around $80. Nothing. I gave her the $80 without a second thought. I would have given her twice that. Ong Quay was a good man. He was Thu's father, and he was struggling. Of course I helped. The next month she came to me and reminded me about the medication. I gave her the $80 again. That became a monthly thing without either of us formally agreeing that it would. By the 4th month, I was giving her $120 for the medication because it turned out he needed a second pill too. And by the 6th month, it was $180 because there was a specialist visit as well. And by the 9th month, I had somehow become responsible for the entirety of an elderly Vietnamese man's healthcare costs. And I had never once sat down and made a decision to accept that responsibility. It had simply become mine, one small monthly addition at a time. The brother, Sang, was the next thing. About 4 months in, he came over one evening while Thu was cooking and sat down across from me at the little table and, through his sister as translator, laid out a business idea for a small warehouse space near the port where he could store household appliances for wholesale buyers. He needed, he said, about 70 million dong to get it started, which was around $2,800. He would pay me back with interest within 6 months. He had, he said, already secured 3 customers, and there was no risk, and this was going to be the one that finally lifted his family up. I looked at Thu while he talked. Her face was completely still. She was translating word for word without any expression, and I could not read whether she was endorsing this or whether she was trapped in the middle of it. When he was done, I said I would think about it. Sang nodded like he had expected this and left. Later, when Thu and I were alone, I asked her what she thought. She said, "Do what you feel is right. He is my brother. I love him, but he has had many ideas. I do not want to influence you. And I want to be honest. I think she was doing her best to be fair to both of us in that moment, but the effect of what she said was to leave me completely without guidance and to let the responsibility for the decision fall entirely on me. I gave him the $2,800, cash. He came by 2 days later to pick it up in an envelope, and he shook my hand with both of his hands, and he said in his broken English, "Grady, brother, thank you. I will make you proud." I never saw a cent of that money again. The warehouse never opened. 6 months later, I asked Thu gently what had happened with Sang's business, and she looked at the floor and said the customers had backed out and Sang had lost the money on the deposit for the space. I asked, "Well, is he going to pay it back?" And she said, "He will when he can." I understood in that moment that "when he can" meant never, and I did not push, because pushing would have shamed her. And I loved her, and I was still telling myself that $2,800 was not that much money in the scheme of things. Sang came back with another idea 4 months after that, a little coffee shop near his neighborhood. This time it was 120 million dong, which was around $4,800. Same pitch, same handshake, same assurances. I gave him the money. That coffee shop actually opened. It was open for about 5 months, and then Sang closed it because, he said, the location was bad. He also, I later found out, had been drinking most of the inventory himself and giving free drinks to his friends. Thu did not tell me this. One of the neighbors did in halting English one afternoon at the market. I said nothing to Thursday. I said nothing to Sang. I swallowed it. That is what I did. I swallowed everything. By the end of my first year in Haiphong, I had spent, and I did the math one night on the balcony with a cup of coffee and a pen and a piece of paper, close to $22,000 on Thu's family. Some of it had gone to real needs. Ong Kuei's medication was real. Nyrt's school fees, which I had also taken on, were real, and I did not mind paying them because I loved that boy. And if I could help him get through school and get somewhere in life, that was worth it to me. But a lot of it, maybe half of it, had gone to Sang and his ideas, or to Ba Lan for household expenses that seemed to keep multiplying, or to relatives I barely knew who had emergencies I could not verify. And on top of the $22,000 I had spent, Ba Lan was still living in my spare bedroom. Nyrt was still on the floor half the time. My apartment was full of people I had not invited on any given evening, and I had not had a quiet dinner alone with Thu in months. I did not say any of this to Thursday. That was my great and consequential mistake. Every night I lay in bed next to her, and I thought about it. And every morning I got up, and I did not bring it up. Because bringing it up meant a conversation that meant confrontation that meant, potentially, a fight. And I did not want to fight with her. I loved her, and I told myself I could handle it, that it was a small price for what I had, that in my old life in Tupelo I would have spent the same money on nothing much and been more miserable while I did it. I told myself all of that, and I meant it in the moment, but underneath it, the pressure was building. I could feel it building. I would sit on the balcony at night after everyone was asleep, and I would look out at the lights of the city, and I would feel something dark accumulating in my chest, and I would tell myself, tomorrow I will talk to her. And then tomorrow I would not talk to her, because tomorrow Ba Lan would be humming in the kitchen and Nyrt would be eating breakfast and Thu would kiss me on the top of the head on her way out to work. And how do you break the peace of a scene like that? With a conversation about how the whole thing is quietly suffocating you. The second year is when it got worse. Ong Kuei had a health crisis, about 14 months, in a genuine one. I do not want to minimize it. He collapsed and had to be taken to a hospital. And it turned out he had a serious heart condition that required a procedure. And the cost of that procedure was going to be around $6,000, and none of it was covered. Thu did not ask me for the money. Thu did not need to ask me for the money. It was assumed, by everyone including me, that I would pay for it. And I did. I paid for it because it would have been monstrous not to, and because I loved Thu, and because Ong Kuei was a decent man who had never once asked me for anything himself, and because at the end of the day, $6,000 to save a man's life is not a hard math problem for a man with over $90,000 left in his account. I paid it, and I did not resent paying it. That is important. There were things I paid for that year that I truly did not resent, and Ong Kuei's procedure was one of them. But the resentment about other things kept growing. Sang came back with a third idea, this one a used car resale operation, and he needed $9,000. and I told him no. That was the first time I told him no. Thu was in the room. She said nothing. Sang looked at me for a long moment, and then he stood up and walked out of the apartment without saying goodbye. Thu did not speak to me for 2 days after that, not angrily, just quietly. And then on the third day she came home from work and sat down next to me on the couch and said, "My brother is very hurt." I said, "Your brother has lost $8,000 of my money already on things that did not work." She said, "Yes." She did not defend him. She just said yes. And then she said, "But in our family, we do not say no to each other like that. If we cannot help, we say, we cannot help right now. We soften it. We do not make the person feel small. You made him feel small in front of my mother." And I said, "Your mother was not even in the room." And she said, "My mother was in the kitchen. My mother heard everything. That is a small apartment." I want to sit with that moment for a second, because it is the moment I most wish I could go back to. In that moment, if I had been a wiser man, I would have said, "All right, Thu, teach me. Teach me how your family works. Teach me the words to say. Teach me the way to say, no, that does not shame anyone. I want to be part of this, and I want to do it right, and I do not know how." I would have said that. And she, I truly believe, would have taught me. And a lot of what came later would not have happened. But I did not say that. What I said was, in my country, when a man is told no about a bad business idea, after 2 other bad business ideas, he takes the no and he goes home and he does not sulk about it. And that is called being a man. And maybe your brother could learn something about that. And Thu looked at me for a long time, and then she got up and went to the bedroom and she closed the door and she did not come out for the rest of the evening. And I sat on the couch and I stared at the wall, and I felt the darkness in my chest tighten another notch. Sang did not speak to me for about 3 weeks after that. Then he did, but not warmly. And he stopped coming over to the apartment except for family gatherings that were mandatory. Ba Line, who I have to say was almost always kind to me and who I do not blame for most of what happened, stopped humming in the kitchen when I was in the room. Nert, who was a sensitive boy and who picked up on adult moods without ever being told anything, became quieter around me. Thu and I kept sleeping in the same bed, but we stopped talking about anything real at night, and I recognized the pattern from 25 years earlier with Rebecca, and I hated recognizing it. This is how it starts, I thought. This is how it always starts. And then the incident that broke everything happened, and I want to describe it exactly as it occurred because everything in this story turns on it. It was a Thursday evening in what would have been my 2nd year in Haiphong. I had been out running an errand. I had gone to a shop to pick up a new part for the motorbike, and I came home around 7 in the evening, and I opened the door to my apartment, and I stopped in the entryway. Because there, in my living room, sitting on my couch, and on my floor, and around my little table, were 9 people. Ba Lan, Ong Kwe, Sang's wife, whose name I could barely remember, their 2 children, an aunt I had met twice, an uncle I had met once, and a woman I had never seen before in my life, who I later learned was a cousin from a village a few hours away, who had come to Haiphong because she needed to see a doctor. All of them were eating dinner. On my floor, in my apartment, without anyone having told me a thing. And here is the part that mattered. There was a suitcase by the door, a large one, and another one behind it. And I understood, standing in my own entryway with a motorbike part in my hand, that the cousin from the village was not going to be staying at a hotel, and that Sang and his wife and children, whose house was small and hot in the summer, were also, I strongly suspected, planning to stay for a few nights, and that no one had asked me a single thing about any of this, and that my mother-in-law had, at some point that afternoon, moved a second dresser into the spare bedroom, which I could see through the open door, presumably to make room for the cousin's things. And I stood there in my entryway with a motorbike part in my hand, and every single thing I had been swallowing for 18 months came up my throat all at once, and I could feel it happening even as it was happening, and I could not stop it, and I did not particularly want to. I set the motorbike part down on the little table by the door with more force than was necessary. Every head in the room turned. Thu was not there yet. She was still at work. Ba Lan looked at me and started to say something in Vietnamese, in her gentle voice, and I held up my hand, and I said, in English, because English was the only language I had, no. And then I said it again, louder, no. And then I said, this is my house, and I want you to hear that I said my and not our, because that was the Mississippian coming out. That was 40 years of a man's castle assumption erupting through my chest and out of my mouth. This is my house, and I do not know who half of you are. And you did not ask me. Nobody asked me. And I have had enough. And I want all of you out of my house right now, all of you. Now. They did not understand the words. Not most of them. But they understood the tone. Ba Lan's face crumpled. Ong Kwe, who was sitting on the couch, put down his bowl very slowly and looked at the floor. Sang stood up and said something sharp in Vietnamese and took a step toward me, and I took a step back and I pointed at the door and I said, get out, get out, get all of your goddamn family out of my house. And I was yelling. I was yelling in a way I had not yelled since Rebecca and I split up. And the small cousin started crying, and the aunt from the village started shouting at Sang, and Sang shouted back at her. And Ba Lan began to cry very quietly in the way that old women cry when they are trying not to show it. And the whole room dissolved into a kind of chaos that I was standing in the middle of like a man who had lit a match, not really understanding it was a match. Thu came home in the middle of it. She came through the door and she saw her mother crying and her brother shouting and her father staring at the floor and her son Nyert, standing in the doorway of the second bedroom with his hand over his mouth and tears in his eyes. And she looked at me and I saw something in her face that I had never seen before and that I have never been able to unsee. It was not anger. Anger I could have handled. It was a kind of horror. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And what she was seeing was a man she did not know. And she went straight to her mother and put her arms around her, and she said something to me in Vietnamese, which she almost never did with me. And then in English she said, get out, not them, you. Get out, go for a walk. Do not come back until they are gone. And I stood there for a second, not able to make my body move, and she said it again, more quietly. And I turned around, and I walked out of my own apartment. And I went downstairs to the street, and I walked. I walked for about 3 hours. Through neighborhoods I did not know. Down streets I could not read. Past food stalls I did not stop at. My hands were shaking the entire time. When I finally came back around 11 at night, the apartment was empty. Everyone was gone, even Ba Lan's things. The spare bedroom was bare. Nyert's things were in a corner, packed. Thu was sitting on the couch, alone, in the dark, and she was not crying. She was just sitting there. And when I came in, she stood up and she walked past me to the bedroom and she closed the door, and I slept on the couch for the first time. I want to describe what I thought I had done that night and what I actually had done, because they are two completely different things. What I thought I had done was reclaim my home. What I thought I had done was, finally, at long last, put my foot down and establish that my apartment was not a communal residence for an entire extended family, and that I was not a bottomless resource for anyone who happened to be related to my girlfriend. What I thought I had done was the thing every buddy of mine back in Tupelo would have slapped my back for doing. Attaboy, Grady, about damn time. That was what I thought I had done. What I had actually done was different, and I only learned the size of it in the weeks that followed. What I had actually done was scream at a 66-year-old woman in her culture's version of a sacred role, the elder, the mother of the household, the grandmother of the boy in front of her entire family, in a language she did not understand, in a way that shamed her publicly, and shamed her son, and shamed her granddaughter, and shamed everyone at that table. What I had actually done was communicate to a working-class Vietnamese family in a working-class Haiphong neighborhood that the American man Thu had chosen did not respect them, did not accept them, considered them intruders in a home he considered his own, and considered the elder of the family in particular to be a burden he had been carrying against his will. And I had done all of this after taking their hospitality for a year and a half, sitting at that mother's table, eating that mother's food, accepting the affection of a 14-year-old boy I had chosen to be a father figure to. And what I did next made it worse, and I want to be clear about that too, because the story is not that I did one bad thing. The story is that I kept doing bad things out of pride for weeks afterward, and each one dug the hole deeper. The first thing I did wrong the next morning was refuse to apologize. Thu came out of the bedroom around 6:30, made coffee, put a cup in front of me at the little table without a word, sat down across from me, and waited. And I know now what she was waiting for. She was waiting for me to say I was sorry, not to her, to her mother. She was waiting for me to say, "Thu, I lost my temper. I said things I did not mean. I want to go to your mother's house today, and I want to sit down in front of her and I want to apologize." That is what she was waiting for. And in the culture we were in, that would have been the beginning of the road back. Not the end of the problem, there would still have been consequences, but the beginning of the road back. What I did instead was drink my coffee and, without meeting her eyes, say, "I am not going to say I was wrong. Thursday I was not wrong. I was pushed to it. There were 9 people in my house. Nobody asked me. 9 people, Thursday. And a woman I have never met, setting up in the spare bedroom. What was I supposed to do?" And she did not answer me. She drank her coffee. And she got up and she went to work. And that was day 1 of what turned out to be my exile from the family, from Thu, from my own life in Haiphong, and eventually from the country itself. The second thing I did wrong was that I did not go over to the family's house for the first 4 days. Thu went every night after work. I stayed at the apartment alone, sulking, and I told myself I was giving them space. But what I was actually doing was demonstrating publicly that I did not think I owed them anything. In their culture, when a rift has happened, the person who broke the peace goes to the elders as soon as possible, humbly, to begin the repair. I did the opposite. I stayed away, which said to everyone watching, and there were a lot of people watching, that I did not consider what had happened to be a rift I needed to repair. It was, in their reading of it, a further insult, layered on the first insult. The third thing I did wrong was, on the 5th day, I went to the family's house and I did not apologize. I went, but I went with what I thought of as an olive branch. I brought a box of fruit and some flowers for Ba Lan, and I stood in her front room and I said, through Thu translating, "I'm sorry things got heated the other night. I did not mean to yell, but I hope we can all agree that we need to talk about how many people are staying at the apartment. That was my apology." Do you hear what that was? That was not an apology. That was an excuse and a demand, dressed up in the words of an apology. And Thu, translating, did her best to soften it. But even she could not soften what I was saying enough to make it into what it needed to be. Ba Lan took the fruit. She took the flowers. She said, through Thu, "Thank you, Grady. Please sit. Would you like tea?" And I sat. And I had tea, and I thought that meant we had made peace. What it actually meant was that Ba Lan was too polite and too raised right to shame me a second time in her own home, and that the family had already decided what they thought of me, and none of it was going to be said in front of me. The escalation, which is the actual subject of this video and the reason I finally sat down and wrote to the man who is telling this story, started about 10 days after that night, and it did not come at me directly. It came at me through the community, through the neighborhood, through people at the market where I had been buying my coffee for over a year, who suddenly did not smile at me when I walked up, through the woman who ran the little laundry on our lane, who had always been friendly and who now would not meet my eye, through the boys who worked at the moped shop where I got the bike serviced, who used to joke with me and who now took my money without a word and handed me my receipt and turned away. In a tight neighborhood in Haiphong, in a working-class corner of a working-class city, word gets around. And the word that had gotten around was that the American man on the 4th floor had thrown Ba Lan out of his house. The elder, the mother, In her culture, that meant a specific thing. It meant he was not to be welcomed anymore. It did not have to be announced. It did not have to be voted on. It just happened. And it happened everywhere at once. And I walked into it every time I stepped out of my building. The next escalation was the threats. And I want to be careful how I describe this because I do not want to make it sound more dramatic than it was, but I also do not want to soften it because it was serious. About 2 weeks after the incident, Sang came to the apartment. He did not come to see Thursday. Thu was at work. He knew Thu was at work. He came to see me. He knocked on the door and I opened it. And he was standing there in the hallway with 2 other men I did not know. They did not come inside. He stood in the hallway and he spoke to me in Vietnamese, which I did not understand, and then he switched to broken English and he said, "Grady, my mother is very sick since that night. Very sick. She cannot eat. She cannot sleep. My father is worse also. All because you disrespect my family. And now you must fix my family. All family. We talk. We think you must give money for the pain you make. If you do not, we make problem for you. Big problem. You are not from here. You do not know how it works, but we know. So you think about Grady. You think..." And then he turned around and left, and the other 2 men left with him, and I closed the door and I stood in my entryway shaking because I understood in that moment exactly the position I was in. I was a 62-year-old American man in a country whose language I could not speak, whose legal system I did not understand, in a working-class port city where I had no friends of my own, in an apartment that I rented, with a girlfriend who was barely speaking to me, and a family that had apparently met and decided I owed them a payment for what I had done. And Sang, the one member of that family I had good reason to think of as opportunistic, was the one they had sent to make the demand. And he had brought 2 men with him. Who were those men? I did not know. Cousins? Friends? Something worse? I did not know. And that was the point. I was not supposed to know. I was supposed to be uncertain, and to be scared by my uncertainty. And I was. I called Cody that night. I had not called Cody in a while. I had been ashamed to, because Cody had warned me about most of this, and I had ignored him. And calling him now to say he had been right about the language and about the family and about all of it felt like more than I could stand. But I called him. It was morning where he was, and he picked up on the second ring. "Pop," he said, "what is going on?" And I told him. I told him everything. I told him about Balan in the spare bedroom for 18 months. I told him about the money I had given Sang and never seen back. I told him about the night I threw them out. I told him about the neighborhood turning cold. I told him about Sang coming to the door with 2 men and saying I had to pay for the pain I had caused. And Cody listened to the whole thing without interrupting me, which is not his style. And when I was done, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Pop, listen to me. You need to come home." And I said, "Cody, I cannot just leave." And he said, "Yes, you can." And I said, "Thu." And he said, "Pop, do you hear me? You need to come home. That is a bad situation, and it is getting worse, and you cannot fix it. Come home. I will meet you at the airport in Memphis. Just get on a plane." I did not get on a plane that night. I want to say I did, because it would make me look smarter than I was. What I did was sit on the balcony after Thu had gone to bed, and I stared at the lights of the city, and I thought about it for a long time, and I told myself, Cody did not understand that I still had a life here I could save, that Thu still loved me, that this could still be worked out. I told myself that Sang was one man, and that his threat was overblown, that if I just held my ground and did not pay a cent, I would call his bluff and it would blow over. That is the Mississippi in me again. Territorial, stubborn, do not give an inch. In Mississippi, that would have been fine. In Mississippi, if a man like Sang had come to my door with 2 men, I would have known who to call. I would have known which of my neighbors would come out on their porch with me. I would have known where the sheriff's office was and what the officer's name was who answered on a Tuesday. In Haiphong, I knew none of that, and I still went to bed telling myself I could handle it. The next escalation, about a week after Sang's visit, was that Thu came home from work one evening and sat down at the little table and told me she was going to go stay at her mother's house for a while. She said it very calmly. She said, "Grady, I love you. I want you to hear me say that, because I do. But my mother is not well, and my family is telling me I have to choose, and I cannot choose you and them, and right now I have to be with them. I need to be with my mother. I hope you understand." And I said, "Thu, this is because of your brother. He is turning them against me." And she looked at me, and I want you to remember this line because it is one I have not forgotten, and she said, "My brother did not turn them against you. You did that. My brother is only the one carrying the message." And she packed a bag, and she took Njert, and she left. And the apartment, which had been too full of people for a year and a half, was suddenly emptier than I could stand. I was alone in that apartment for 11 days. I want to describe what those 11 days were like, because they are the days I would go back to and change if I could change anything. I sat on the balcony in the morning with my coffee, and I looked out at the city, and I understood, for the first time, really understood, that I did not belong there. Not because of anything the people of Haiphong had done, but because I had come there without preparing myself, without learning, without asking, without listening. And I had built my life on top of a set of assumptions that did not apply, and I had watched those assumptions fail one by one until they had failed all at once. I sat there and I thought about Balan in her kitchen, humming, on the mornings when everything had still been all right. And I thought about the way she had put her hand on my arm the first time I had eaten at her table and had told me through her daughter that I had kind eyes. And I thought about how I had, in one bad night, made her cry in front of her family, and I thought about how I had refused to say I was sorry the next morning, and I understood, for the first time, that I had been the villain of my own story for weeks and had not known it. I called Wallace Trundle on day 7. Wallace is another American, 67, who had been in Vietnam for something like 15 years. He lived down in Ho Chi Minh City, which is why everyone called him Saigon Whitey, a nickname he was not fond of but which had stuck. I had met him once, on a trip to the South, and we had traded numbers and stayed loosely in touch. He was the closest thing I had to an American friend in that country, and I called him because I did not know who else to call. I told him the story, the whole thing, and he listened to the whole thing. And when I was done, he was quiet for a while, the same way Cody had been quiet. And then he said something to me that I have thought about every day since. He said, "Grady, listen to me. You did not have a money problem. You had a culture problem. And you tried to fix a culture problem by yelling. Out here, you can be 100% right and still lose everything because it was never your call to make. The apartment was yours, sure, but the family was not yours to accept or reject. You accepted them when you took the woman. That is how it works here. You did not read that. You did not ask. You just moved in and you started keeping score, and one night the score broke you. And now you are sitting there thinking about how you are going to win this. There is no winning this. There is only leaving and getting out with what you can and going home and being older about it than you were before. That is your only move. You hear me? That is your only move. I sat with that for a couple of days. I did not want to hear it. It went against every fiber in me. But every hour I sat in that quiet apartment, I understood it a little better. Sang came by again on day 9, with the same 2 men. He did not knock this time. He stood in the hallway and he called out my name, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, and I opened the door and he said, "Grady, we have talked. The family says 400 million dong. That is what you owe for the pain." He said it in Vietnamese first, and then in English, and 400 million dong was around $16,000. He said, "We know you have the money. We know. And you will pay. Or we call the police. And we tell them things about you. Things about the boy. About Njert. That will not go well for you. You are not from here, Grady. Think about it." And that is when I understood what he was actually threatening. He was not threatening a lawsuit. He was threatening to make an accusation about my relationship with the 14-year-old boy who had lived in my apartment for the last year and a half. A boy I had taken to school in the mornings and picked up in the afternoons and helped with homework and treated like family. An accusation like that against a Western man in a Vietnamese city, I did not need to know the legal system in detail to know how that would go. I did not need Wallace to explain it to me. I stood in that doorway, and I felt the blood leave my face, and I did not say anything. And Sang looked at me, and he smiled a very small smile, and he said, "Think about it," and he left. I called Cody that night. It was the middle of the day where he was. I said, "Cody, I am coming home." And he did not say, "I told you so." He did not say a single thing along those lines. He just said, "All right, Pop, when?" And I said, "As soon as I can arrange it." And he said, "All right, I will get you at the airport. Just tell me when." And that was the whole conversation. That is my son. He is a better man than I am. I have said that already, but it bears repeating. I want to tell you what I did next, because it is the part I am least proud of and the part I most need to say out loud, because saying it out loud is part of what this whole exercise is for. I took $22,000 out of my account. I converted it to Vietnamese dong. I put it in a plain envelope. And I went to Ba Lane's house, alone, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I did not tell Thursday. I did not tell Sang. I went to Balan's front door and I knocked, and she opened it, and she looked at me for a long moment, and then she stepped back and let me in without a word. I sat down at her little table. She poured me tea. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and she waited. And I put the envelope on the table, and I pushed it toward her, and I said, through the phone translator I had opened on my lap because I could not do it any other way, Balan, I was wrong. I am sorry. I hurt you, and I hurt your family, and I hurt your daughter, and I hurt the boy. I am going home. This money is for the family, for your husband's medicine, for the boy's school, for whatever you need. It is not for the pain your son said I caused. There is no amount for that. But it is what I can give, and I want to give it before I go. I am sorry, Baline. I am sorry. She looked at the envelope on the table. She did not touch it. She looked at me. She looked back at the envelope. And then she said something in Vietnamese that the translator on my phone did not catch clearly, and I did not ask her to repeat it because I did not need the exact words. I could see them in her face. And then she nodded once, and she took the envelope, and she put it on top of her little cupboard, and she poured me more tea, and we sat in her front room in silence for about 20 minutes. And then I got up and I bowed to her, the deep bow I should have learned to give her 14 months earlier. And I walked out of her house and I went back to my apartment and I began packing. I did not see Thu again in Vietnam. I sent her a message that I was going home. She sent me a message back that said only, "I understand. I do not blame you for going. I am sorry it ended this way." And I wrote back and I told her I was sorry too, that I loved her, that I did not know how to be who she needed me to be there, and that I hoped she would forgive me one day. She did not answer. I do not know if she has forgiven me. I do not know if she will. I do not think she owes me forgiveness. She owes me nothing. I flew home on a Thursday. Cody met me at the airport in Memphis. He hugged me, which he had not done since he was maybe 17, and he drove me back to Tupelo. And we did not talk much on the drive. And when we got to his house, his wife had made supper, and my grandbaby was in a high chair banging a spoon. And I sat down at their table and I ate. And I did not cry until after everyone else had gone to bed and I was in the guest room with the light off. And then I cried for about an hour. For Thursday for Balan, who I had made cry in her own front room. For Njerd, who I had let think I was his family and then had disappeared on. For the man I had thought I was when I got off that plane 16 months earlier. And for the man I had turned out to be by the end. For all of it. That was almost a year ago now. I'm living in a little rental house, not far from Cody's place. My savings, after everything, are down to around $58,000. My pension and Social Security still come in every month. I got Boone back. He is 15 now and mostly blind, but he still knows my voice. and he sleeps on the foot of my bed like nothing happened. I go to a therapist in Tupelo twice a month. That is not something men in my family do, but I do it because Cody said I needed to, and because when your son tells you something like that, you listen. My therapist and I have talked at length about what happened, and she has helped me see it in ways I could not see it while I was in it. She says the pattern I ran is a very old one. Long-term conflict avoidance, followed by explosive rupture. She says it does not make me a monster. She says it makes me a man who never learned another way, and that at 62 it is not too late to learn one, but that I will have to work at it. I am working at it. I have not heard from Thu directly since I left. I heard through Wallace, who still lives in Ho Chi Minh City and who kept an ear out for me as a favor, that Ba Lan used most of the money I left for Ong Kue's medical care and for the boys' school, and that some of it went to Sang, which does not surprise me, and I am not going to sit here and pretend I am glad about that part, but most of it went where I hoped it would go. I heard that Ong Kue passed away about 6 months after I left. That hurt me more than I expected. He had been kind to me. I wish I had said goodbye. I heard that Nerd is doing all right in school. I heard that Thu is still at the garment factory. I heard she has not seen anyone else. That last part, I do not know what to do with. I try not to think about it. I do not have the right to think about it. If you are watching this video, and you are a man in your 50s or 60s, and you are lonely, and you are thinking about starting over in another country with a woman you have met online, I am not going to tell you not to do it. That would be a lie coming from me, because for 16 months, until the last few, my life in Haiphong was the best it had been in decades. Thu was real. Her love for me was real. The city was real, and the life we built was real. I do not regret going. I regret how I was when I was there. That is a different thing. And I want to make the distinction because I do not want anyone watching this to walk away thinking the moral of this story is that you cannot find love overseas or that all foreign families are out to get you. That is not true, and it would be an insult to the family I hurt to leave you with that impression.